Welcome back. So in our previous video we talked about recognition, and in this particular video we'll be dealing with function primitive recursive and function recursive. So that's, we'll find out when do we say a function is primitive recursive, when do we say a function is recursive, and then we'll try out examples, and also said we'll talk about the derivation de function recursive, primitive recursive. So let's begin. So when is a function said to be primitive recursive? A function is said to be primitive recursive if it is gotten from either the function de base, the base functions, or if it is gotten from other functions that are already primitive recursive. That is, we can get them from reg de composition or reg de recursion. So you can see now that the introduction that we did actually is like, it's very important to understand the concept so that we can be able to, you see how we are going to use that a lot as we keep going on in this tutorial. So it's a function, I repeat, is said, I'll write it down. Une fonction est PR. PR means primitive recursive. So a function is PR if one soit une fonction de base. So it's either a base function or a function that is gotten from other functions that are already primitive recursive, and we can get them from reg de composition and reg de recursion. So maybe you can also put this in your record book, so when solving you know how the rules to follow. So it's either a base function, which is the first part, or it's a function that is gotten from other functions that are already primitive recursive. That is, when I'm solving, let's say I'm trying to find if a function is primitive recursive, and then I come to, let me say, the factorial of x, and then I remember that in I already calculated that factorial of x is primitive recursive. At that stage, I don't have to calculate again why the factorial of x is primitive recursive, because I have already calculated it. So that's what it's trying to say, that it's constructed. I'll just write it that it is already primitive recursive, like we've already proven that it is primitive recursive. You get? So it's either a base function, which we discussed, the successor, the null, the projection, and soit une fonction construite à partir d'autres fonctions PR au moyen de règles de composition ou de recursion. So we use règle de composition or règle de recursion to prove that a function is primitive recursive. So the second definition is, when do we say a function is recursive? In this case, you get to see the difference between the primitive recursive and the recursive functions. So a function now is said to, this is the first definition. The second definition, une fonction est recursive si, that's if I used if here, yeah, I'm using C. One, it's the same thing if it's a function de base. So if it's a base function, And secondly, the same thing with the primitive recursive, soit une fonction construite à partir d'autres fonctions PL au moyen des règles de composition ou de récursion. So I'll write the same thing here. Soit une fonction. The only thing that makes the recursive stand out is, in this case, we are going to use all the règles for recursive. For primitive recursive, you notice that we used only règles de composition and règles de récursion. But in recursive functions, we are going to use all the règles that we've studied. That's including règles de minimisation. So that's, if you notice that, you also know that it means a function that is primitive recursive. A function can, all functions are primitive recursive, but not all recursive functions. How do I put it? All recursive functions can be primitive recursive, but not all primitive recursive functions can be recursive, because primitive recursive functions, they don't have the règle de minimisation, but recursive functions, you find everything. So that means also when we are defining primitive recursive functions, we define them using the two règle composition, règle de récursion, but we don't use the third règle, which is règle de minimisation. That règle is only for recursive functions, not for primitive recursive functions. So I repeat that all function PR can be a function recursive, but the inverse is not true. Okay, so all function primitive recursive can be a function recursive, but the inverse is false. I think I said the other way around before, so I'll repeat it so we get it now. All function primitive recursive, that's this, can be recursive, because here you can find everything that you need in primitive recursive and recursive functions. So a function that is primitive recursive can be recursive, but not all function, but the reciprocal is false. That's not, a recursive function cannot be a primitive recursive function because the règle de minimisation is not in the primitive recursive functions. So now we are going to answer questions. We'll be giving questions and then we'll answer them. Okay, I thought we could do that in this video as well, but I think we should just do it in the next video, so there will be based on, we are going to be solving exercises. So thank you and see you in the next video.